All right, we're here today with Lou Mathews and Jim Gavin. How are you guys doing?
Good so far, but it's early.
Oh, it is early there, huh?
Very good. Thank you for having us, Aug.
Well, thanks for coming. Talking about the book. I guess there'll be video, but audio too. I'll hold it up for people to see. Shaky Town, which we'll get to discussing in a minute. But my first question is always, tell me about when you fell in love with literature and writing.
Go ahead, Lou. I need to think about my answer.
I was raised in libraries, and my mom was a Catholic school teacher with 5 boys to support. No money, so we spent all of our off time in libraries. And from the time I was probably about 4 or 5 years old, I was bringing home 5 books a week, and started with ancient history, and then discovered science fiction when I was about 8 or 9. And I remember getting the first book that actually hooked me was Robert E. Howard, Conan the Barbarian.
Okay.
And I actually still have a library copy of that book, because he wrote with such conviction. I mean, it's still a book that I prescribe to people. I prescribe books the way pharmacists prescribe drugs.
Nice.
And if I get somebody who's spending too much time in their head, I force them to read Robert E. Howard, which gets them rid of that really fast, because they say this is a guy, he's an accountant from Texas who kills himself when his mother died. But he wrote about this world of, swords and sorcery and cruel barbarians. It was a world he believed in so strongly, and he drew maps of it.
Yeah.
So it's like, anybody who approaches writing with that kind of conviction, and I don't care how bad the writing is, and and sometimes it was, but it's just like, it makes you, it just works. It works for you. But that was the first book that that really I remember being impressed with.
I might have to give that a read. I do tend to get in my head a bit too much, but that's not if you're prescribing it.
It's the Grove. It's the Grove series, not Grove, Arbor House, I think it is. But they were Midwestern stuff. But if you could find an old library copy, and the fact was that Robert E. Howard was pretty much rewritten by Theodore Sturgeon, and I can't remember the other guy, L. Sprague de Camp, and those are actually the best versions. So, but there are a lot of them out there.
Yeah, I was not precocious as a reader or a writer at all. Growing up, most of what I read were like sports biographies I really enjoyed. Weirdly, I tended to read biographies of people who I never watched play, like Willie Mays or Bronco Nagurski. And in high school, like if I were reading, I only read what was assigned. If I wasn't, I was probably reading a John Grisham novel and really enjoying it. And then in high school, I think towards the end of high school, I went through this period. I was kind of floundering. I didn't know what I was going to do after high school. I assumed I'd go to junior college, and there are these AP classes which are kind of like you have to apply to get into based on grades. And I thought I should apply for AP English, but I didn't think I was smart enough to do it. So I didn't take the test or whatever. And I remember on the last day of my junior year, there was a final that was being proctored by the AP English teacher for the next year, senior year. And we did the test, and it was the last test. I was done for the year. Summer was ahead of me, and she was walking out the door. And I just had this weird feeling. It's only happened once or twice in my life that my future was walking out the door.
Wow.
And I chased her down into the hallway, and I was like, Mrs. Egan, hi. Is there any chance I could still apply to get into AP English with your class? And she asked who my teacher was my junior year. And I said, Brother Aquinas, which is hilarious because Brother Aquinas taught Lou 90 years before at another high school. And we happened to be right outside Brother Aquinas' classroom. So she walked in I stood outside. She came back out, and she said, well, Brother Aquinas said, you did well in the class. He was surprised you didn't try and get into AP English. And she said, I'll tell you what, read these 2 books over the summer, and I'll give you a test on the first day of school. And if you do okay, I'll let you in. And so the 2 books were Crime and Punishment and East of Eden. And I read those books with such intensity and lived them so intensely. I feel like I just swallowed them whole, and that was like my whole summer was like reading those books. And I showed up at the first day of school, like just ready to take this test. And I go find Mrs. Egan. She's like, I'm ready to take the test. She's like, oh, you don't have to take the test, you're in. So like, she kind of tricked me into becoming a reader. And then in that class I remember we read Catch-22, which kind of changed. It was the first time I had read something that was literature that also was seemed to convey my feeling, or I consider everything I do comes out of comedy, and that was comedy in its purest form. So I was probably about 18 before I became a serious reader of any kind. But after that, I tried to make up for lost time.
Yeah, I didn't get to Catch-22 until 5 years ago or so. It just kind of passed me by. When I read it, I loved it. I mean, it's so funny.
Yeah.
And the comedy is a big thing for me too. What are some other books like that you think are hilarious, but literature as well?
The writer who I kind of appreciate, or two of the writers that I think have had a pretty big influence are Evelyn Waugh, his kind of earlier novels like Decline and Fall, which is, I think, Bruce J. Friedman called it a perfect novel, and I would agree. It's like the Sistine Chapel of like a comic novel. And then Charles Portis, I think, is probably the great comic voice of the last 50 years in America, and probably I think is in the last 10 years, 15 years has definitely kind of come to the fore again, and kind of deserves his place kind of next to Twain. I think maybe not has the same scope, but like his kind of American vision of the kind of absurd and comic, and also deeply human. So yeah, those 2 come to mind. Other writers I like, Muriel Spark, I think, has a certain cruel scalpel-like genius. But yeah, those 3 come to mind.
How about you, Lou?
You mentioned one you had on your pick. Paul Beatty's book is just genius. I think that is probably the funniest book I've read in the last 10 years.
The Sellout?
Pardon?
Sellout?
Yeah. And a book that was rejected 40 times, which is also something that intrigued me. But no, and particularly if you grew up in Los Angeles, it's just he just nails it. But it's like nobody knew that there were cowboys in Compton until they read that book. And in fact, that was a garden city for many years. But yeah, I love that book. I feel the same way about some of Invisible Man. That's not a book that most people think of as funny. But I think there are parts in it that are hilarious. But
it's got the full scope. The other writer I'd throw in there, like kind of more contemporary, I think, is Sam Lipsite, who what he's doing is as a comic stylist. I mean, you can spot a Sam Lipsite sentence from space. I mean, he's just amazing. And I just recently read his last one, which came out, I think, about a year or 2 years ago, Hark, which, I mean, just has me rolling on the floor, and it's so dark and true and Lipsitean.
I don't know. I'm gonna have to check him out. That's a good
recommendation.
recommendation.
His first. Well, it's not his first novel. It was the novel that I think kind of got. It was 2004, called Homeland, which has nothing to do with the television show. It's a man writing letters to his like alumni newsletter, of his high school. And it's from a man who has not quite panned out in life. But it's pleading letters. It's great. So yeah, Sam Lipsite is, I think, in the last 20 years, I think he's kind of had his finger on kind of the dark pulse of like American anxiety in just a really fabulous way.
I mean, you're saying you could spot one of his sentences from space. I remember clearly we had to read Evelyn Waugh's Vile Bodies in college. And I remember the professor saying, no one writes prose like Evelyn Waugh does. And like, aside from the laughs, it's just, I'm always impressed by every sentence when I'm reading it.
Yeah, I 100% agree. The guy was a complete bastard. His later novels are I can take or leave, but yeah, I mean, there's some passages in Brideshead Revisited that are just like so stunning. Like you put the book down. Yeah, he's just just one of the bigger assholes ever. So just gonna.
Who's got some?
Fortunately, I turned to my right when you guys were, and this is a book that if you haven't read it, it is absolutely hilarious. It purports to be the literary biography of Jeffrey Cartwright. Excuse me, of Edwin Mulhouse, by Jeffrey Cartwright. He writes this when he's 11 years old. And it's, Milhauser is genius. The other thing I loved about him is that he left Brown University on leave from his MFA and never went back, and then wrote 12 books that including a Pulitzer Prize winner. But that book and the other book that I still think is one of the funniest books ever written is Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson.
I haven't read either of those. I will.
You don't know that book?
List. I don't.
Oh my God! You don't know Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son?
I'm sorry.
Calm down.
I don't.
Man, you got to read that. That's kind of well, Michiko Kakutani thinks it's the best collection of short stories written in the last quarter century, and I would agree with that. But you're in for a treat. I envy you for that.
Excellent.
And then after that, you can see the movie they made of it, which is also fairly cool.
I'll put them on the list.
So, yes, I think we all have long lists.
Yeah, if we won't get anyplace else, believe me, if you really once I start looking around the rest of the shelves.
I just start. Sorry.
And one last one, Mr. Biswas, A House for Mr. Biswas by B.S. Nepal, which is also sort of screamingly funny.
Excellent. Yeah. I finally started Finnegan's Wake last week, so it might be a while before I get to anything else. I might take a break after the first book.
I have not done that. So good luck. That's amazing. Yeah, I have you're just in the wilderness. Good luck. Bring a machete.
I had poison ivy for like 3 weeks, and they finally put me on steroids. So like one night I was just like up and like full of energy. I'm looking at my books up like I've had this book for years. I haven't gotten around to it. Tonight's the night to do it at like 1 a.m. And I was like, I mean, I love it. Like it's beautiful sounding, and I love all the references. Mm-hmm. I'm just getting swept along by it. But as far as making some sort of sense out of it, that's a whole nother story.
Yeah, it feels, for one of the passages it's more like kind of listening to like a Gregorian chant or something than what we would know as a novel. Some reason I've there's certain things I've decided to put off until I'm probably there now to my older years. Like I always heard you shouldn't read Proust until after you're 40. Yeah. So I have never read Proust, which is a good excuse not to read Proust, but not anymore because I'm past 40.
And Chekhov after 50 when he starts to make real sense.
Yeah.
But I decided long ago not to read Finnegan's Wake, but instead I've collected versions of the street ballad Finnegan's Wake, and have versions from the Clancy brothers who run about 6 minutes, Irish Rovers, and the Pogues, and then the fastest version is the Dropkick Murphys, who bring it in at about 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
Are either of you JP Donlevy fans?
Oh
Yeah,
yes, God,
yeah.
thank you. I'm a huge JP Dunleavy fan. And I think he passed away about 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah. Oh man,
Um,
I would have loved to.
he
Have met him.
gave if you have in the Paris Review, they have all those great interviews, and he gave my favorite writer interview ever. And there's one where they asked like, why did you become a writer? And he said, for fame and money, which I think is the only honest answer anyone's ever given. I think, Lou mentioned the Pogues, who named their famous song "Fairy Tale of New York" after. Doesn't have much to do with the Dunleavy's novel "Fairy Tale of New York," but I think that's one of the great comic novels of all time. As far as like set pieces and dialogue, it's just phenomenal. Yeah, totally unique. He's one of those writers who basically wrote the same book every time, but you forgive him. So
that was actually one of the earliest bonds that Jim and I had.
Wow.
was Donlevy. And one of the things I used to always quote, and it was a quote that I found in my junior year in a writing class, and one of my teachers brought it in, and it's a quote from Donlevy, and he says, "Writing essentially is turning our worst moments into money."
That is a fantastic
that
quote.
was a really profound and optimistic way of looking at writing. I'm thinking, and he did it quite a lot. He was one of the few who actually could turn it into money. But that one stayed with me.
Yeah, good call. Yeah, gotta put him on the list.
So what was it that made each of you decide that writing was something you wanted to do with your life?
I'll field that first. For me, it was that's something I was like running towards, and I felt like I was being chased by. In your 20s, you have the notion of being a writer and what that would mean, and it's totally false. And some people can figure it out early. I was not one of them, and I think. From like basically like 25 to 30, I didn't write anything. But I read a lot, and I think at some point in that period, I had to grow up a little bit more, and all these things. You have some losses in life, etc. And I think at some point I just felt like I wanted to try it again, but I didn't do it with any sense of there being a career, and I still don't. There's been no plan, but there's just been a kind of a dedication to trying to get something right. I guess that's just what that means. That's craft, right? I guess you read the good stuff and you try and want to make the good stuff. And at that point, I had a pretty clear that it's pretty foolish to expect a career out of writing. But once you kind of realize you're going to do it anyway, that's kind of maybe the real beginning of a writing life, I suppose. I guess once you give up, that's when you begin. And it's carried on. I mean, obviously in the last 4 or 5 years, I've been incredibly lucky as far as I work in TV now, and that pays the bills, and I never thought that would happen. I always, but I feel like if I had planned that was my goal to do that, it just wasn't ever going to happen. So it was more just kind of sticking with something that I thought I was good at. And then, I'm someone who's gotten 2 or 3 incredibly lucky breaks, and I try and honor that by doing the work.
Yeah, that's basically, I didn't see it as possible as a career, except as a journalist. But what actually started it for me, in high school, I worked for the Glendale Public Library system, and there were 2 librarians there in the fiction area, Marie Weiss and Eva Thompson. And Marie in particular, I think she figured out I was going to be a writer before I did, because she would press books on me. And she would say, and it would be always, you have to read this. And the first book she gave me was a book by Nell Dunn, an English writer, called Up the Junction. It's 139 pages. It's the first book I ever read cover to cover and then opened it up to get into page one. I was like 16 or 17 years at the time. And I was just knocked out. If you haven't read her, it's a remarkable book. It's sold about 2 million copies in paperback, was made into 2 different movies, one by Mike Loach, I think, or Mike Lee. Anyway, you can,
Mike Loach is a perfect
yeah,
portmanteau
combo, good combo.
certain
Yeah,
British.
a movie that needed subtitles. But basically, it's an heiress from Chelsea who lives in Battersea, which is this really rugged area. And it's the most compressed writing I've ever come across. I actually read her before I read Hemingway. Once I read Hemingway, I found out how much she'd gotten from Hemingway, except she took him to the next level in terms of just absolutely giving you just enough to keep it moving. But it's a remarkable book. So that was the first book. And the second book she gave me was Fat City by Leonard Gardner. And that was, as I tell people, the book that ruined me for the low wire. Because the fact that that book was even published meant for an entire generation of writers that it was possible. It was possible to write a book that mattered. And it was writing about Stockton, California, one of the least promising areas that you could imagine. Except there are 2 books that have come out of there, Maxine Hong Kingston's Woman Warrior and Leonard Gardner's Fat City. And that's a better average than San Francisco has, or New York, as far as I can tell. And those are the books that convinced me. But it was a long jump from that to actually writing fiction. I thought I was going to be a journalist. And then when I got to UC Santa Cruz, I took a writing class and realized that was where I was headed. But most of the writers I know, you don't have a choice. But I remember in my first workshops, I'd be dealing with these people who said they had to write every day. If they didn't write every day, they were just destroyed and helpless. And fortunately, those guys would drop out after about 3 classes. But, I never understood that. I wrote when I could, and it was always kind of, streak stuff. But never thinking that, you're going to be able to make a living at it. And for me, at least, that's been true.
So let's talk about Shaky Town. Tell me how it all came together. Like, give me some history, because in the intro you mentioned that Dora Pena found Crazy Life in a San Antonio library back in '91.
Yeah,
I assume that had been around for a while. Which
the earliest portions of that book, and that would include Crazy Life, The Garlic Eater, were all written in the mid to late 80s, 85, 86, 87. In other words, I always knew I was going to write a book about where I grew up. And where I grew up nominally was South Glendale, but where I did most of my growing up was a barrio called Toonerville, which is right on the LA River. And that was who I hung out with. Those were the guys. I didn't date an Anglo girl till I was like 18, 19. But that was who I ran with. And I knew that I wanted to write about where I grew up and how I grew up, because nobody else was doing it. And I didn't realize till years later that we were not suitable subjects for literature. But by then I was already writing the story, so it didn't really matter. But as I say, it was a book that was assembled over about a 30-year period. And part of that is the fact that I'm a perfectionist. I'm something of a miniaturist. And I'm also really stubborn. And I write to suit myself, and this ended up exactly as I wanted it to be, which would not have been the case had it been published with a large New York publisher. There would have been adjustments to be made. There would have been concessions to be made. And the fact is that there were a lot of changes. I mean, originally that book was about 120 pages longer. And then when we I cut out about 6 stories. And even then, going through it the second time with Jim, ended up cutting out about another 35 pages. And it just really became less is more. But the whole process was really kind of a joy. And part of it was that it took so long, it was over such a long period of time that you had time to get it right, and do it exactly the way you wanted to. So, yeah. I mean, just something as simple as working with the artist on the cover, Steve Powers, Espo. I mean, the guy was just amazing. But that was like, 3 months talking about what the cover should be about. An artist who reads the goddamn book, when have you run into that before, and got it? And, at that point we started talking, we realized, as Jim says, that we were bonding on some molecular level. And once I started talking about the place and mentioned Van de Kamp's Drive-In, which was this fantastic modern, it was like one of the great examples of modern architecture, and with these windmills, turning and neon. And once he heard about that, it was just like, bam. And there's one thing you have, you don't have to, you just have the advanced review copy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Take a look at that cover through dark glasses, because the way that Steve did it, you're supposed to be looking at neon on a dark night through a car windshield. So look at it through some dark glasses and you'll be amazed at how it pops.
Nice.
And the printers couldn't get the black as any of us ever wanted, but it's still, you put on dark glasses and you get an idea of what it can be. Yeah, weirdly, when you photograph it, it shows it's even brighter.
Yeah.
And I dug how the sort of sun palm smile hammock smiley face appeared like in the text. That was a cool little motif.
Yeah, our book designer did a great job. That's like those kind of fun things that happened along the way that I wasn't expecting, and then I thought, yeah, that was really cool. And like, the whole deal, with Tiger Man publishing Shaky Town, it was to make like a beautiful book. I mean, the thing you can hold in your hands and make it lovely. So a lot of, we wanted to put some care into that. And I think I'm very proud of the object as a, Lou's writing aside, whatever, I can take or leave. But the book itself, the book itself is good. So.
That's really interesting about the time it took to write it, because I couldn't really had I not picked that up in the intro, I wouldn't have been able to tell, which is the goal, I assume. But I loved how it sort of built upon itself, like by the Huevos story, which is the 4th or 5th. I was like really, really engrossed, staying up later and later to read it.
And it shifts back and forth in time, which was a conscious choice as well. In other words, with Crazy Life is talking about something that happens after a book, a story in Huevos, in Gonzalo's Rifa that happens, 100 pages later in the book. But that weave seems to work for most people.
Yeah.
So I love playing with time in that way.
So I know you've written about this, Jim, it's in your intro, but for anyone listening who doesn't know the story, how did you two meet?
Lou and I met, I think it was September, October 2005. Basically, at the time I was working in plumbing sales and lived in Long Beach, and I hadn't written anything in a long time. And during that period, I had an old friend who she had my friend Liv, she had a party somewhere up in LA. And then I went, and like, I wasn't very social during this period. I was just like on the road all day and then going home and falling asleep to Sports Center. And so I went to this little party, but there was a lot of really cool people there, and I had a nice time. And she was taking a class at UCLA Extension, and some of her classmates were there, and it was just like, oh, this kind of seems fun. And that kind of got in my head of like, that's something I kind of want to do. And it almost at that point had less to do with writing, just like, I just want to go someplace where I can, talk about books, and maybe I'll write something. And so eventually I did sign up for a class, and I looked up Lou, and I looked up his book, and I didn't know who Lou was. I didn't know who anyone was. Just like, but I saw his book, and I ordered his book, and his first novel, LA Breakdown, and I really loved it. And I probably had started it when I took the class, and then met Lou, and so it was just a great experience in the class. And I took another class with Lou probably in the spring or something, and then Lou has mentored like a generation of writers, and we kind of got to be pals. And he has like an informal writing group at his house, and I started going there, and then I got to know Lou's wife Allison, and all. There's kind of just this whole group of people, writers in LA, and and it was really great. And so we've always so we've known each other a long time. And I moved back. I was gone for a while. I moved back to LA, and it's just a long friendship. And along the way, a great mystery was, to me, it was like, why wasn't Lou better known as a writer? I mean, he's really well known as a teacher, and someone who's been published in lots of great places. And it just, one of these things, every writer goes through it, but I think in a sense they're all whiners, because Lou's had to wait much longer. And a series of flukes in my kind of career, essentially. But basically, I was like, it's time. It's now to put this book out. It's kind of like the result of just 15 years of bullshitting about books and playing terrible golf and eating. Lou's a great cook, so I've been blessed to sit at his table many a night. Favor I've never ever returned, and I don't think I ever will. We had this great launch last week, and I won't get into the weeds, but like Tiger Man, I partner with we're an imprint of a independent press, larger independent press, Prospect Park Books, which was founded by Colleen Bates, who's a wonderful and hugely responsible for a lot of this happening, because she kind of guided me through this whole process of publishing something. But at the launch, she kind of talked about just this kind of galaxy of things, of people who know each other, and how this book kind of comes out of that. It's out of a literary community, which I probably have taken for granted for a lot of the time, but it's a real thing. I feel lucky to have come through it, and to now maybe replenish it. So anyway, it's a very long answer. Thank you for indulging.
Yeah, when did you
showed up in classes in 2005, and this was still back when I was asking people what they were reading. I sort of gave it up, about 5 years later, because I was so disappointed with what they were reading. But Jim started talking about Evan Canal, and I looked at him and say, how the fuck do you even know who Evan Canal is? I mean, this is a brilliant San Francisco writer. And he's best known for Son of the Morning Star, but he did Diary of a Rapist. He did, he just did these extraordinary books, mostly written in the 60s and early 70s, Mr. and Mrs. Bridge. And the fact that Jim even knew who this guy was just kind of startled me. And then he started going through some of the other things he was reading. And I thought, oh, well, this is somebody who's serious. And then, of course, once I started reading his writing, there was sort of an instantaneous bond. A lot of ways we read about the same people.
Yeah, kind of a
and-
misshapen Catholic upbringings and Southern California places and then so forth. Yeah, so there's a lot there, and and we both had Brother Aquinas as an instructor, which still blows my mind, which is the funniest thing ever. But
Brothers
anyway,
of St. Patrick.
yeah, I don't think he's with us anymore. But.
No, that's, and of course, that's the other reason that many of my books take so long to publish, because I have to wait till everybody's dead, so they don't sue me. If you know me well enough, you could go through my books and find the names of a lot of friends and neighbors. And for instance, if you go to The Last Dance, and you start reading the names that are in there, I mean, one of the names that's mentioned is Miguel Sandoval and his wife Linda. And of course, that is Miguel Sandoval, the actor who ended up reading that story at our book launch. But I have a habit of doing that, and it started with LA Breakdown, and so I have to make sure that everybody's dead before the books are published, so they won't sue me. But the other thing is, like, when you do that, you can actually, I actually am making most of my living now by writing titles for other people. But the other thing I do, if I'm working on a story, and I'll put somebody in the story and then explain to them that for a certain sum they can upgrade. In other words, like, you don't have to be a pederast priest. You could be the noble, guy whistleblower. But it's about $500 difference. So. And that works out pretty good.
About the money, like Don Levy said.
Yeah, more money in titles than there is in writing. So
What was cool was that earlier in the year I had read John Doe's Oral Histories of LA Punk. I don't know if you're familiar with those, or if you were into any of that music at all, because it was kind of that the 80s time period and all those bands and sort of the cool chapters about Los Lobos and the Latino punk scene. I was wondering if you were a fan of that stuff.
Jim was more into punk than I was, I think. I had kind of a really weird education. I got locked in on Lieber and Stoller in the early 50s and middle 50s. I can remember listening to Coasters Searching over and over and over again. And then Dylan, but I was always kind of out of the loop. I have a friend, Steve Erickson, who's a well-known writer in town. And I think the only thing Steve ever was impressed with that I did or envied me for was I got to meet Joe Strummer from The Clash, and Joe and I actually got to be buddies. And the reason was I didn't know who The Clash were, and that apparently is a really good starting point with any rock and roll hero, because, if you don't know who they are and you don't know what they represent, you can talk to each other as human beings. And Joe is this really engaging guy, and actually explained something about those world. We were talking about I used to do a lot of journalism, and we were talking about another musician I'd interview. I found to be sort of an asshole. And Joe, and I was saying something about that, and Joe looked at me and said, "Well, who or what would you be if nobody had said no to you for a decade?" And I started thinking, I said, "Yeah, okay." But as I say, my education, I mean, Steve had his revenge. I got back and he bought me The Clash on Broadway, the 3 CD set. And I suddenly realized, what I had a hold of. I was just amazed. But so I'm still discovering stuff now. But it's a really retro list. Los Lobos is on the top. That was actually the soundtrack we had for the book launch, was Kiko and the Lavender Moon, along with, but also about 12 mariachi songs, rancheras and mariachis, and which is going to be played at my wake. Everybody has to listen to the La Negra every third song.
Yeah.
So,
I was going to ask, is it usual to have 3 mariachi bands at a function? When I was reading that story, it's like,
that's really unusual. That's really unusual, but it's the kind of thing you do if you really want to make a splash. And as I say, when you are surrounded by mariachis, it's like the best stereo in the world. There's nothing like it. There's nothing like it. And you know, they basically have to stagger themselves. The horns have to be in the back, so it's like they don't overwhelm. But no, it's the story about whose songs is true. You know, that if I hadn't had my wallet taken away from me, I would have bankrupted myself. Yeah, I grew up loving the songs of the Revolution in particular. My grandfather was essentially a village elder in a little tiny village in Baja California, El Rosario. And I started going there when I was about 6 or 7. So that was the music I was raised around, and I still have, you know, I'll still, you know, get misty-eyed over the Alita. But it's a real mix. Jim is actually the music guy among people.
Yeah, I haven't read that John Doe book, and I should, because all that stuff's pretty big for me. I mean, generationally, I missed like that heyday of like Minutemen and Black Flag and all that, but it was still, you know, I worked at a gas station with guys who were like 7 years older than me, who had gone to all those shows and were complete maniacs. And yeah, so I came to, you know, be very interested in all that stuff. I mean, some of it's really great to listen to, but culturally it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
And then in college, from 94 to 98, I went to Loyola Marymount, which has a radio station, KXLU, which was kind of like the flagship of like punk in the 80s, and is well known for breaking a lot of bands like Nirvana and Beck and places. So I did a radio show there. So I was kind of ensconced in the LA music scene of the 90s. And it was weird when I think about it now, just as it's not like, this was an era where like there was like an ethic of like indie, like underground, like this was our own thing. We don't care about, you know, majors and all this stuff, which I think is, I don't know how you would explain that to someone who's like 20 years old now. Like, what do you mean? Like you were deliberately trying to avoid money, essentially, which is such a weird, but like that ethic was very strong. And I, you know, which is weird because I, like in the 60s, like all the stuff I love now the most is kind of crazy 60s psych and garage. And I'm always kind of searching through that stuff. And all those bands, you know, they didn't want to be obscure psych garage bands. They wanted to be the Rolling Stones. Like they just were passed over. And that's always been a big thing for me, is like, why did we miss this at the time? And anyway, so I think some of that mentality of a punk rock, kind of indie rock, DIY ethic has kind of stayed with me in some fashion. And I think it does animate a little of like Tiger Man books, in a sense of like, this is we don't really know what we're doing. We don't really know how long this will last. We're going to put something in the world and see what happens. And I love that. I mean, I think I'm sure John did like Henry Rollins' Get in the Van, which is an amazing, it's his tour diary with Black Flag in the 80s. And among everything else, the thing that's crazy about it is just how goddamn hard they worked.
Yeah.
I mean, they were eating dog food like in abandoned warehouses, but they just worked really hard. It was such a weird mentality that it's hard to get across. And they were so like weirdly monkish and aesthetic and all this shit. I don't want to go down that road. I don't want to be eating dog food. That's the line. But yeah, some of all that kind of the chaos and kind of all the different kind of sociological components of that era of punk are of endless fascination to me, and have kind of influenced, you know, my thinking in some ways that I feel is kind of antique. Like I just don't think if you're a band now, you are, in a sense, you have more freedom and more than you ever have, in the sense that you can't make money. There's no more rock bands. There's nowhere to go. So you might as well just do exactly what you want.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, right now, like, you know, in California, the last like 10 years, this kind of neo garage stuff like Ty Segall and the OCs. We used a couple OC tracks on Lodge 49. Those guys have a similar, they're just maniacs. They put out like 3 records a year, and they're not crafting a career. They're not like, there's no way up to the top. They're just doing what they want. And so in that sense, if you are comfortable with a small audience, and just putting something good in the world, and you have the means to do it, it is a very good time, because with social media and all that stuff, you can kind of reach people in different places. Yeah. But also everyone's screwed. So
Yeah.
But there really is something, like you were saying before, Lou, about knowing that it's what you want it to be. Yeah. That no one else has interfered with it, that it's yours.
Yeah, no, I mean, this process was a joy. And I was talking to my friend Dana Johnson, who was also part of our launch. Jana's, I can't call her my oldest student because she doesn't like that, but I will say she's my earliest student.
Yeah.
And now the head of the writing program at the doctoral program at USC, and a full professor.
Yeah. And a great writer.
But she was a student of mine in '92. And I was talking about the process of the book, and particularly about, you know, the 2-3 months we had to work on the cover. And she said, shit, you know what happened to, you know how I find out of my cover? I said, what? She said, well, about, I think it was about 2 days before the book was supposed to come out, they just sent me this photo and they said, here's your cover. I said, what? Are there any other options? And they said, oh no, didn't we talk to you about this about 6 weeks ago? No. And that was what you got, you know, and it's just sort of like, and it's same thing with the editing all the way down the way. I don't know that we actually did any line editing at all. The only thing we did was cuts.
Right. Yeah.
There was no line by line work at all. So basically what you see is, you know, is my version. You know,
I wanted there to be a murder mystery at the heart of all this, but Lou refused. So, spoiler: there's no murder mystery.
Yeah, but we have to work out the through line on this, you know, the selling point. And then when LA Breakdown, which is my first novel, came out, and they would always get the question, well, what's the book about? I said, well, I think it's about life and death and love in the streets of Los Angeles, but everybody else thinks it's about fucking street racing. So, yeah. You know, so we haven't worked out our signature line for that yet, but but I think that Jim's manifesto pretty much says it all. Can you remember that, Jim? Or do I have to recite it?
Right. Yeah. So we have a website, tigermanbooks.com. If you want. But yeah, no, the Tiger Man Manifesto is what is it?
We believe in books. Am I mirrored here? Can you see it?
Yep, we got you.
We believe in books. Our business model is failure. We plan to lose money and fold quickly. Join us. All right. And of course, I've been trying to get Jim to add 2 other components. One is not sold in stores. But the problem is that he's got the Tiger van up and running, but he hasn't got it registered, because we figured that, you know, if you buy 10 books, we'll deliver it for you. You know, we'll deliver it in the Tiger van, and then we'll read from the back. You know, there's actually enough room for 10 people to get in there. But that's one motto. And the other motto that we have used at the book launch was, you don't have to read the book. You do have to buy the book.
Yeah.
And that's been pretty successful.
That's smart.
You know, once the pressure is off, people know that they don't have to say,
at that point,
come and tell me what they thought about the book. It's much easier to sell, you know, particularly people who know you.
At that point, you can buy 10 copies. You're not going to read it 10 times.
Yeah, some people did. Some people did, because it's like, you know, because I'm never going to ask them, what did you think of the book?
I like the delivery idea. Do you know when Gene Simmons put out his Vault box set a few years back, and for like 50 grand, he would deliver it to your house? It just seems so insane.
Wow. Okay. This is all coming together.
We'll be a
I
lot
don't know.
cheaper
I don't know
than
if we
that.
can justify charging 50 grand, but
Okay.
we'll see.
Well,
A
I
book?
think $50, and if you pay for the gas, because that's
Yeah.
gonna be a gas
That's
hog.
pretty
So
fair.
Yeah, good God.
yeah, that would totally do it. That would totally do it. So and God knows we got nothing else to do.
So what are the plans for what's coming next?
I mean, we just kind of want to figure out how to do it on this book, and then we'll see. We're kind of in a transition because Colleen Bates, who I mentioned earlier, she is retired from her position, and so we have a few things to figure out. But I would like to, if possible, just keep publishing kind of two types of things. One, like great literary fiction like Shaky Town, and also really kind of strange niche stuff. Maybe some of it inspired by the erstwhile television program Lodge 49. But we'll see. I think this has been a learning process, but it's been great. I mean, once you kind of see the book and get it, you kind of like, that gets you excited. So there won't be probably anything for this year, obviously, but maybe we could figure out something for next fall, and go from there. But yeah, the great thing is no one's waiting for it.
Yeah.
We have all the time in the world to figure it out. So I'm also doing this while working on other stuff. So it'll be a labor of love, and in the fullness of time, it will be what it's supposed to be.
You got to have L. Marvin Metz out there. I mean, that's just.
We'll see if I can track him down in Mexico.
Yeah. If you survive the flight, yeah. But
So Lee,
yeah,
you got something else in the works?
I have another novel that's finished, called Hollywoodsky, and it's similar to Shaky Town in that it moved back and forth in time. The difference is that it's about a failed screenwriter, or actually he calls himself a fated screenwriter. He says only poets can fail. Screenwriters can only fade because the bar is set so low. And at one point, he was a fairly successful screenwriter. He started as a novelist, and he made the mistake of taking a writer's strike seriously, and went after a producer. He had information that a producer was writing during the strike and hiring and making other writers work on it during the strike. And he went after him. And at which point the producer went after him, and his career was basically destroyed. So now he teaches at small Christian colleges. He teaches screenwriting. He teaches, wherever he can. He scuffles to make it. You can find the two stories, the starting story. If you go to the New England Review, if you go to their archive and just type in Lou Mathews, you'll find two of the stories from that book. Some Animals Are More Equal Than Others, which is very loosely based on the making of Walker with Alex Cox in Nicaragua, which is something that I actually participated in. I was covering the story for Mother Jones, and also had an acting part in that. I play a bishop saying a prayer over the corpse of Marley Matlin, and then Ed Harris shoved me out of the room. So that was pretty exciting. But so those two stories give you a pretty good sense of what the book's going to be about. But it's 8 stories about a fated screenwriter named Dale Davis. And then he has 3 stories that he's written that sort of chart his dissolution. It's sort of the rake's progress for screenwriters. But so that one's done, and don't know exactly what's going to happen. As I say, if something happens with Shaky Town, if it takes off, and if somebody east of the Mississippi reads it, and gets interested in what else I might have, because as we state on the dust jacket, I've written 7 books and published 3. So there are 4 other books out there. 5 books if you count the cookbook, but
The cookbook.
that's kind of a
That's probably going to be the bestseller. Unfortunately,
probably. This is something I put together for my daughter.
That might actually sell.
Yeah.
What are your specialties?
Across the board, but mostly what's called California Mexican, which is a lot like Tex-Mex. But in other words, I'm fairly famous for my mother's chiles rellenos, which are not like the chiles rellenos you get in the usual Mexican restaurant. They're canned chilies or hatch chilies that have been, but they're baked rather than, they're fried, but then baked. So it's a whole different thing and a whole different flavor. But that's very much a California recipe. But most of these recipes were published in the LA Times. I was a food writer for about a decade and a restaurant reviewer for 7 years and 43 pounds. So there's a big backlog, but
you may have said that line once or twice. You may have.
Yes.
There's a certain polish to it that.
My first time.
It's well rubbed. It's well rubbed. That's the problem with Jim, is that he catches me on my tropes.
Yes, we all have them.
I remember a journalist friend of mine pointing out that, being a food writer is the way to go, because at least you're getting fed.
Yeah. Well, it was the people around me who really loved it, because I would have to go to a restaurant twice. I would have to take 4 people with me. And of course, their only obligation was to eat the food and then occasionally let me have a bite. And I ended up actually have an expandable fork that goes about, it comes out of a handle and it's about that long, so that I can reach across the table and deftly spear, the best portion of whatever's on somebody else's plate. But when my daughter graduated, when she got her doctorate, I said, "What do you want for your present?" She said, "Your recipes." But being the thrifty freelancer that I was, I wouldn't just write them down. I had to get paid to do it. So I started writing that. So there's now about 35 to date, but they all come with stories.
Oh, nice.
So that there's are you a foodie at all? Do you?
Yeah, but I have a very strict diet, so
Okay.
vegan and gluten-free. But
If you
I
go
do
to
love that
Taste
stuff.
Magazine, which is the online component for 10 Speed Press and Norton, and it's the biggest food site in the world. You'll find a story there called Chili Verde, which was actually part of Shaky Town and was the last story. It was supposed to be the last story in the book, and we cut it. That's about the burrito king of Shaky Town. And it concludes with a recipe, which is my recipe for Chili Verde. So the cookbook is a lot like that. Every recipe comes with a story.
I like that.
So it's you can have a lot fewer recipes and a lot more stories that way.
Speaking of stories, Lodge 49. Are we gonna? Can you talk? Are we gonna know at some point what happens next, or can you talk about this?
All I can say is, I'm still very heartbroken, and that it got canceled for reasons that I understand, but also change of executives that happens. I mean, for now, I can't say there's anything gonna happen. I will say this, like for me, the show is our actors, and there's no version of finishing the story that would be at all satisfying to me that doesn't include them. So putting something like as a novel, I mean, well, a novel would take a decade. I mean, the novel I'm currently writing is like 8 years past deadline. So like, and yeah, and just to like, oh, this is how, like, I will never just say like, you can't do it. Like it, so I'm open to the possibility of Sunday maybe figuring out a way to do it with our cast. But in the meantime, I just hope people keep finding it and spreading the word about it. Otherwise, there's no, there's nothing I can do. But stranger things have happened, and I'm very proud of what we made. And I think, we didn't get to finish it, but I think we delivered something pretty special that I think hopefully the world will catch up with at some point. In a sense, we're, I like to be, like a psych band from the 60s that, never, quite made it, but maybe is rediscovered. So we'll see. Hopefully it won't take 40 years, but we'll see.
But for $50,000, he will come to your house and tell you the ending.
Yeah.
In Kiss makeup?
Yeah, exactly. That might be the way to do it.
We didn't talk about Pynchon. I always assumed the Lodge 49 was a reference. So what do you? Yeah,
it's weird. I like with Pynchon, I feel like it might be an overdetermined signifier there for our show, in the sense that when I was writing it, I wasn't thinking of Pynchon. And when it came time to title the show, I was like, all those lodges have numbers. Like it has to be, Lodge 49, it has a nice ring to it. But then when I step back, I can see the influence. I have a big Pynchon reader. My life happens to cross a lot of the things he was writing about, like a kind of the, 60s aerospace and its legacy and, all these things, and kind of like, basically the Pynchon's like, something else is going on beneath the surface that we can't quite see. That's like the general mood that I've always found, delicious. And so yeah, in that sense, it's an overall influence. But yeah, I mean, it's not. It doesn't go. There's other, I think, like someone like Evan S. Canal or Portis or Borges is probably actually a bigger influence on what actually is happening in the story, but kind of like some of the milieu, some of the moods are definitely a huge influence from Pynchon, who he's amazing. He's the best. He's still with us. He's still, so who knows? I remember, I know where he lived in Manhattan Beach when he was out here in the 60s. And I forget how I kind of came across it, but I know the apartment. And about 7-8 years ago, I was wandering by it because I was in Manhattan Beach, and it was for rent. And the door was open, and so I wandered in, and there was someone painting. So I stood inside there, and I had no money at this point. I wasn't a TV jerk. Otherwise, I may have like gone into a tiny studio on one of those terraced hillsides overlooking the Pacific, but it's where he wrote a good portion of Gravity's Rainbow. And yeah, now there's probably some like trust fund USC kid in there who doesn't have no fucking clue. But so that was a big deal. He's always, a lot of my reading life kind of kicked off with discovering Pynchon in college. Like it just sends you in a ton of different directions. And I was, that's a period where I was kind of maybe more interested in more bigger intellectual pursuits. And at some point as a writer, you need to make yourself stupid. And so most of the stuff now I think is more pulls at the heart rather than the brain maybe. But I've gone back and read all the stuff since we did Lodge 49. It's been a joy. So yeah, the 49, it's there. I think it was a little accidental or random that I put it there, but then when I stepped back, I could kind of see like, oh, it's probably inevitable. So
I I lived in LA in 2016, actually in Atwater Village. So it was cool getting all the
Okay.
Glendale references in Shaky Town. But one day I had got the address and I made a pilgrimage down to Manhattan Beach. I
Oh,
was like, "God,
wow.
if I-"
Yeah.
The door wasn't open. I didn't get to go inside, but it was super exciting. Like just being there and
Yeah.
like, wow.
This is how I found it, because in 2003 I went to London for the first time, and the BFI had showed this weird documentary, which I don't know if anyone like is someone it's kind of about Pynchon, and like someone like was trying to trace where he had lived, and they went and they talked to an old girlfriend of his. They didn't say the address or anything, but she was just standing outside this apartment, and I kind of just took a mental picture in my head of like, I'm gonna go find that. I don't know whatever happened to that documentary. It's actually really strange. Because I only saw it just there once.
Wow.
When I got back to LA, I wandered around Manhattan Beach. And I was like, that's it. That's where it is. And so I knew. And then later, I think the address kind of got out there at some point. But I did detective work. I went and found it. Yeah.
Do you know the name of the documentary? I would love to see that.
I can't even remember it. It was really weird. And I had a weird experience with it, because they actually, towards the end, I didn't like it, because they were like, they found him in New York, and they like, I think showed like a modern photo of him or like a video, and it really pissed me off. And they kind of warned you about it. And I remember I closed my eyes. It was like, I'm not gonna fucking do it. And
Nice.
I remember having a really strange, it was an semi-interesting documentary. And then I like, oh, this is a violation. Fuck you. And I covered my eyes. I may have dreamed all this. Maybe this documentary doesn't actually exist. Someone should look it up, like go find it. But no, he definitely kind of is always hovering in the shadows. And if you spent any time in Southern California, I will to plug my friend Josh Tyree, JM Tyree. He just wrote a book called The Counterforce, which is a really accessible, really great book about, in particular, Inherent Vice, the book and the movie. But it's also just an overall take on Pynchon and our current moment. It's just really a great book. He's very kindly gives a shout out to Lodge 49, which is really cool. So any Pynchon fans out there, you should read The Counterforce by J.M. Tyree.
It's a great little book. So.
Yeah.
Actually,
There's a lot of cross-pollination. And one of the people who taught in the writers program with me is a woman named Phyllis Cabaur, she's the only person I know who had a blurb on her novel from Thomas Pynchon.
Wow.
And it's because she and her husband were close friends of Pynchon's, both in Seattle and in Manhattan Beach. And at one point, she had, I think, copies of every one of Pynchon's book, pristine copies that were signed, which she donated to the writers program. And along with other things, there were some photos, and one of them was a photo in that apartment in Manhattan Beach. We also learned that he lived, which isn't documented, in West Covina for a sizable period of time. And the way we found that out was that his agent, Melanie Jackson, who's now married to, one point I had some connections with her, and I sent her Steve Erickson. Steve was there in the office and happened upon a letter that was to Melanie from West Covina from Pynchon. So it's like, Jesus, you learn all this.
God, what are we doing? Just all these weird stalkers here.
Yeah.
He knows, he gets it. He's the smartest one, because he left. He doesn't need to deal with any of it.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, this has been great. Thank you guys for coming on the show. Is there anything you want to add before we sign off?
No, man, I really appreciate you having us on, and it means a lot. People taking the time to check out Shaky Town, and so it's very cool. So thank you.
Okay.
Cool, man.
There's a couple things I want to talk to you about after, because I don't want you to give out your address on the air, because you don't want fans or Gene Simmons coming over. But there's a couple of things I want to send to you and tell you about. So
Excellent.
okay.
Cool.
Well, I'll sign off now and then.